Okay, while we're setting up here, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Dionysios Bouzos, who is Vice President for Emerging Markets with Merck. He has really been in the trenches in the emerging markets. I've met few people who have spent as much time actually in the trenches in the emerging markets. I mean, he started his career right after he got his MBA from Wharton, took a 3-month assignment in Russia to help Merck get off the ground in Russia, ended up staying there 15 or 16 years. Can you imagine going on a 3-month assignment and then staying on for 16 years in Russia? He then moved to Novartis and helped them set up shop in China. He helped Novartis turn around its operations in India. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that a guy like this is very valuable. So Merck got him back, and now he's doing for Merck what he did for these other companies and in other countries. So he leads the charge in Merck across the emerging markets. And he is based in China, but I'm told he spends 2 days a month in China. And the rest of the time he's on a plane or he's in a hotel somewhere, which is good for us because if he were not traveling so much, there's no hope in hell we would have him here in Boston. So he's come down from New York to join us this morning. It's been a hectic morning for him because of things happening in the company. So I greatly appreciate, Dionysios, you making time for us. Thank you so much. Dionysios.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. This morning, as Ravi mentioned, you'll probably be seeing it on the news wires tomorrow morning. Our company is undergoing a major transformation, and so unfortunately, we had to juggle the agenda a little bit, and I'm very appreciative of the other speakers who were able to do that. I've been on conference calls since about 7:30 in the morning, and I have another series after this. And it's the nature, I guess, of our business, of our industry, that there is continuous change. And as I say, you'll see in the news tomorrow morning, Merck is undergoing a transformation and is shedding approximately 20% of its workforce, which is fairly significant for anyone who's in business, and is making some other very critical decisions about focus and market focus. And I'm very happy to say that a number of the emerging markets are in the focus for Merck continuing its business. And so, with that, I'll transition to the topic of today's talk. And today's talk, what I'd like to actually share with you is, what I've entitled "To BRIC and Beyond." And it's about the emerging frontier of the emerging markets. Before I go into that, I just want to perhaps give a little bit of background as to why I'm talking about this. And Ravi, again, already spoke a little bit about this. I've lived for about 15 years in Russia, 16 years in Russia. And one piece of advice I want to give everybody is if anybody offers you a temporary assignment, be very, very careful. Because 3 months did turn into 15 years, but 15 very wonderful years and years full of experiences that I am sure would have been not possible had I followed a more traditional route. And about 6 years ago, I moved to China with Novartis to start up operations there and continue to be based in Beijing, although, as Ravi said, I'm in China at best maybe a weekend a month, apart from the work I'm doing in Shanghai where our office is based. So most of my career, about 20 years, has been in the emerging markets, and it's been predominantly in the OTC industry, within the pharmaceutical industry, but more specifically within the OTC industry. My background, I'm Greek. I don't know if there are other Greeks in the audience. Yes? Oh, good. Excellent. So a few Greeks. So I grew up in Greece in a very, very small village, 150 people. Since graduating from business school, I've spent the last 21 years in either Russia or China and traveling extensively throughout the emerging markets. Most of my focus has been Eastern Europe, Asia, Middle East, Africa, a little bit less so on Latin America, although with touching Latin America, at various points in my career. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit, I guess, empirically rather than academically, although there is a bit of hopefully fact-based and academic background to some of my thoughts. First of all, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on BRIC, because BRIC is a topic that has, I think, been exhausted within the academic sphere as well as the business sphere. You know, one of the things I find surprising is that the term BRIC really only came into popular parlance about 10 years ago. And it just seems to me to have been around for a lot longer than that, but it was really about 2001 where Goldman Sachs, the chief economist of Goldman Sachs, is credited with coining that term. Everybody knows about it, you know, very big countries, huge populations, and yet a disproportionately smaller part of the world's GDP. Now, some of the interesting facts, right? To me, one of the most interesting is that there are more billionaires now in BRIC than there are in Western Europe. For those of us who have lived in some of those markets like China and Russia, it's probably not surprising. The number of Mercedes and Rolls Royces and Jaguars that I see on the streets of Moscow is astounding. And I'm embarrassed to be driving a BMW or a Volvo these days. China, as everybody knows, the economy is huge. Brazil is growing rapidly, overtaking the UK. Russia is sometimes thought to be the odd man out in the BRIC markets, right? The population is not Chinese or Indian, and it's not necessarily booming as much as some of the other markets, especially since it's so reliant on the price of oil, and its GDP fluctuates tremendously on that. But one of the things that Russia does have, it does have amongst the BRICS the highest GDP per capita, and the differences between the lowest and the highest levels of the demographics is much smaller in Russia, which means that growing middle class is evolving and emerging much, much faster in Russia than it is in some of the other BRIC markets. However, as I know you've heard just recently, the BRIC markets are, quote unquote, slowing down. Now, slowing down is a relative term, right? If you are from Taiwan, where the growth is -1% a year, or in Germany, where they're lucky if they're happy if they can get to 1 or 2%, when you look at a 4% or a 5% growth rate, it's hard to call that slowing down. But nonetheless, when you look back at the early 2000s or the late 1990s, and you recall the heady optimism of the BRICS, where it was high single digits, low double-digit growth. I, for one, remember speaking to my board when I was at Novartis, and I was talking about growth rates of 20, 25, 30%. And I can tell you I experienced and drove compound annual growth rates in Russia over a 5-year periods of over 50%. So when you think about numbers like that, and then you come back to today's reality, we call it slow. And we call 5 or 6% quite slow. So, and there's still a distinction amongst the BRICS, between India and China on the one hand, and Brazil and Russia in terms of their relative growth rates. What I find quite interesting now is in the 1990s and the early 2000s, I found myself playing a role in the boardrooms of lobbying for investment for BRICS. We need to put in resources, we need to place our bets, we need to develop infrastructures in these markets. Now, curiously, I find myself in the opposite position of saying, you know, we need to actually diversify out of BRICS. And we need to find alternate avenues of growth, and we need to start placing a broader spectrum of bets. And it is a little bit difficult because I think it took a long time for a lot of people in the boardrooms to accept that the world was not going to be Western European, it was not going to be white, it was not going to be this sort of upper middle class, you know, housewives in Britain and the UK, and that the reality is that 1 out of 3 consumers in the world today are Chinese or Indian. And after years and years and years of drumming that through people's heads and showing them the statistics and showing them the prognoses and the forecasts, I'm now in the position of saying, well, yeah, all that's true, but now you need to open up your mind even more and start to think about the world outside of the BRICS. Because we can't win, and when I say win, I mean be a truly global player with your fair share of market and a fair share of your profits coming in from streams that don't exist today. We cannot win unless we actually diversify. So it really is an interesting role, because I literally find myself now on the global leadership team arguing against BRICS in an odd way. So what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit of my thinking of, well, what is beyond BRICS and where should we be looking? I do warn you, I am not going to be prescriptive, and a lot of people say to me, okay, Dionysios, where should we be placing our investments? Where should we be placing our bets? Should it be this market? Should it be Latin America? Should it be markets in Asia? And I'm telling you from now, you're not going to get a direct answer, but you will get an indirect answer, or at least an indirect answer from my perspective, based on my experience. Let's take a look at the economic rankings that are, again, these are based on a combination of Goldman Sachs projections as well as the World Bank projections. And regardless of the source you use, you're going to come out more or less with this ranking of markets. You can see, of course, where BRIC is, and you can see, of course, that China has, come very close to the top. And you see where the Brazil, Russia, and India are. Plus, you see the next set of 10 significant markets. Now, what's interesting about the next set of 10 markets, and you try and think, well, what is common about them, and what is it that actually places them on this list of top 20s? And I can go through a lot of different statistics about economic output, and you can talk about, where their future growth is coming from, and natural reserves, et cetera. But the reality is it's population-driven. Okay, all of the markets up there have, with a couple of exceptions, in the 100 million plus range, 80 million. Korea is a bit of an exception, but Korea, as everybody knows, is already quite developed and so has a lot of upside. Turkey's at about 88 million. It's closing on 100 within the next decade or two. But generally speaking, the markets really are being driven by population, and that's clear. Population, consumption, growth. Now, if we look at 2015, a few years ahead, you won't see too many changes in those rankings, right? You'll see Russia, India inching up a little bit. China continues to be in the second position, and there's a few changes in the bottom 10. There's a couple of switches. People are moving up or down 1 or 2 positions. So nothing really exciting here. If we take another 5 years and we look at the growth projections, we see, again, not terribly significant differences between 2020 and 2015. India continues to inch its way up into the rankings, and you see, again, some differences in the other 10 markets in terms of them switching their positions, here or there. The real interesting piece, though, comes a generation later. So it's the world that our children will be living in, and that is looking at 2050. If you look at 2050, I really believe that these changes can really be now, they are quantum changes. They are transformative changes with regards to the world's economy. First of all, amongst the top 5, there is only one, quote unquote, Western European / white country up there. The United States has now slipped to the second position, having been surpassed by China. You'll see the next markets, India, Brazil, Mexico. And then, of course, you'll find many of the heretofore leading markets in the world, Western European markets, are now relegated to the second half of those 20 markets. I've indicated with check marks some of those markets which, in my opinion, are truly transformative. You'll find Mexico leapfrogging into the top 5. You'll find countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, and Vietnam making enormous strides in terms of their global impact on the world. So again, to me, what this says is, as we develop our global strategies and as corporations sit and think about where they are going to be in the next generation and what they need to do, we need to begin thinking about these kinds of numbers and these kinds of transformations that are taking place in order to ensure that our strategies anticipate these changes and are structured in a way to take advantage of the opportunities that this kind of change represents. if you dig a little bit further into those rankings of the top 20 countries, it actually is much more interesting to look at them not just in terms of rankings, because the rankings conceal the differences between the markets. And if you actually look at them a little bit more closely and you look at the numbers, what you actually see is there's really three buckets of markets that are going to be leading the global economy. China, by far, will outshine and outpace everybody and will be the undisputed global economic leader. You will then have the United States and India duking it out for the second spot. And I think it's actually a really interesting potential model if India and the United States can kind of come together and create a much more aligned and combined synergistic relationship to outweigh or at least to counterbalance the role that China is going to be playing in the global economy. I think that there is enormous opportunity for both the United States and India to come together in that way to counterbalance the Chinese ascendancy. And then, of course, you get the next vast group of markets, which within about a 20 or 30% range are within one another. So going from Brazil all the way down to Vietnam, those markets constitute what I'm calling the third bucket of markets. That will all be very, very similar. And as you can see, that third bucket of markets leading global economies are, for the most part, markets that today are relegated to the bottom of the heap of the emerging markets, with very few of the traditional leaders in that group. You see the UK, you see Germany in there, and that's about it, and France as well. So the vast majority of that second bucket of markets is going to be led by those markets that we today term as emerging markets. So the question really is, well, which of those many, many markets should we be looking at? And one of the things that the emerging markets has, in addition to a lot of people and a lot of opportunities, is we're also very, very rich in acronyms. And I try and sort of make sense of them, and I've only indicated here the most commonly used acronyms in terms of grouping emerging markets into various sort of leagues or various sort of cooperation groups. We have the BRICS, the MIST, the N11s, the 3Gs, the civets, the Maiden, the Eagle's Nest. And again, I've excluded the G20s, which is actually 23 countries, and the G77, which is actually 73 countries, and a host of other acronyms and groupings. But the reasons I selected these is they tend to be the most common ones and the ones that are talked about most often. And each of them is quote unquote correct. Each of them is right in its own sense, because each of these groupings uses a different set of criteria for selecting who are the next up-and-coming group of markets. For example, the Mavens, if you look at that particular collection of markets, and by the way, the Mavens is simply the acronym of those markets in the list, they're weighted heavily towards natural resources. And so when looking at their indices in terms of which markets make the cut, the fact that Mexico, Australia, Vietnam, and the other countries have large sources of natural wealth puts them into that grouping. If you look at the N11, everyone knows what the N11 stands for? Next 11, okay? Very, very easy. So the Next 11 is a Goldman Sachs configuration, which attempts to use a similar methodology when they develop the BRICS concept to then say, well, what is the next 11 using the BRIC concept? And this is the group of countries that emerge from that. I find for me, one of the most interesting ones is actually the Eagles. And the Eagles stands for, let me see if I get it right, Emerging and Growth Leading Economies. So the Eagles is actually an interesting grouping, and it differs from the other groupings because the other groupings tend to use very static measures, right? There is a certain set of principles, there's a cutoff, and you either are in or you're out of that particular grouping. And they change occasionally depending on sort of new data, or in the case of South Africa and BRICS, intensive lobbying by South Africa to be a member of the BRICS grouping. But generally speaking, they are fairly fixed. The Eagles grouping, for me, is quite interesting because they take a much more dynamic approach. They actually are looking at not absolute value of those economies, but incremental growth that those economies give to the world economy. So to make it into the Eagles group, okay, your growth over the next 10 years has to be greater than the average growth of the G7 developed economies minus the United States. So let me repeat that. So take the G7, take the US out, the average growth rate for the next 10 years, the average growth absolute amount for the next 10 years, and if your market has the same or more than that average growth, you are considered to be basically driving a significant amount of incremental global growth. So the Eagles listing every year changes depending on the outlook for a particular economy. So up until this year, Egypt was also a member of the Eagles group, but with the recent turmoil and disturbances in Egypt, which have seemed to have set back Egypt considerably economically, Egypt has dropped off of that list. The Eagle's Nest, which is now perceived to be sort of the next layer or the next tier of Eagle markets, is actually also quite interesting, and it's slightly insulting to Italy, so I apologize for anybody here who may be from Italy, because the only criteria necessary to belong to the Eagle's Nest grouping is to have incremental growth over the next 10 years greater than Italy's. Okay. And the reason for that, of course, is that Italy is the least growing of the G7 markets. So you have to do better than the least growing of the developed economies in order to be considered within the Eagle's Nest. So this is all very interesting theoretical, groupings and indicators and, which acronym you particularly like. I look at it from a very pragmatic perspective, right? I'm sitting in a boardroom. My boss is saying to me, okay, Dionysios, where do we place our bets for the next 5 years? Where do we begin to develop infrastructure? Where do we invest our resources and our people and our capital in order to drive growth? That's a much harder question to answer. I like the academic question. But the practical question is, well, I look at this and I say, well, what are the commonalities when I look at all of these lists, okay? And when I look at the commonalities, and I don't know, the color seemed to have come out. What I've tried to do here is indicate those markets which are common across at least 4 of those significant groupings. And you'll see there's quite a number, right? Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, Nigeria, Vietnam, all seem to be coming up, regardless of the methodology you use. They tend to be making it into that top bucket. So without wanting to be overly prescriptive, I would suggest that companies that are correctly considering an expansion of their global view beyond the BRICS should be taking a very, very close look at the markets here that are in color, because they do have most of the fundamental indices that go into determining potential are present in these markets. It's a combination of population, economic output, transparency of government, levels of corruption, ease of doing business. Again, many of these countries have a long way to go in several of those parameters, but the dynamic is in the right direction. Now, nonetheless, even after doing that and after sort of looking at these countries and finding what are the common threads across the markets, it is imperative that companies take an industry perspective to their decisions. And as an example, I tried to take an industry that was outside of my experience, and I looked at the automotive industry. And when I look at the automotive industry, this is based on work done by Ricardo Consulting, which is a leader in automotive consulting. And this is their chart of basically saying, where will the next winners be? And they group them into various groups. But what I actually found most interesting is the checkmarked one. The ones that I've checkmarked are actually markets that don't even appear, for the most part, on all of the previous lists. So if we look at the automotive industry very specifically, yes, you'll see many of the same culprits. You'll see Indonesia, you'll see Mexico, you'll see Turkey, you'll see Vietnam, you'll see South Africa. But you'll also see Morocco and Argentina and Ukraine and Thailand. So what I guess my point really fundamentally is, yes, we can look at the overall numbers, we can look at the overall analytics, we can make some conclusions about likely winners overall, but nothing can substitute for an in-depth industry look at the markets to truly determine where are those markets where your market, your company, your industry, your capabilities will actually find the best foothold and create the greatest opportunity for your company to succeed globally. So trying to sort of put that all together, when I think about it and I try and talk about this with my colleagues or with colleagues from other companies, there's no doubt about it that BRICS continue to be critical to the global economy, and it is imperative that companies continue to invest and grow to win in those markets. However, we also have to be aware that we now have growth coming from significant markets outside of the BRICS that are in the forefront of global economic growth. Now, there is no consistency around what those markets are, but there is some evolving consensus around who the likely winners will be. And from a corporate perspective, in the interests of risk diversification, competitive advantage, and the opportunity to create regional platforms, making a very thoughtful selection of what are those next group of markets that your company will enter and win in is really crucial. But those markets will vary by your industry, perhaps by the company's history, and also, of course, by your own company's capabilities. Some markets will provide opportunities for some companies, and those same markets may not, due to both historical reasons of the company as well as some of the cultural or organizational aspects of the particular company. So to summarize, what I say to people is that to win, you must win in the BRICS, but to win, you can't win only in the BRICS. And that's the message that I try and preach to my company, with some success. But it is a message that is complex because the answer is not easy. And so one of the goals that I've set for myself is to try and make that a little bit easier by simplifying the analytics and by trying to be very, very thoughtful and precise with regards to the assumptions and the parameters that we use for making those selections. With that, I'd like to end. I'm really very, very thankful to have had the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. And I guess I'm open for questions now, if there's anything.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. Can I just ask you, what is your list of countries, or can you not speak about that? My company, the consumer division of Merck, was created only 3 years ago after the merger. So I would say that we are really in the beginning of our journey. So right now, we are focused on the BRIC markets, with the exception of India, as we discussed last night, and that's for historic reasons. And adding, Mexico into that mix. So it's really very, very much still focused on the BRIC markets plus Mexico, although I am doing my bit to establish some critical footholds in some of the key Asian markets. One of the things we were discussing last night is if this were my company and my money and I was just about to embark on a global expansion, that's probably where I would place my own personal bets, which would be on the quote-unquote second tier of Asian markets, on the Vietnams, the Indonesias, the Thailands, the Philippines, as offering probably the best bang for our buck, and potentially a bit less competition from the multinationals versus what we're finding in places like Latin America and Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Yes.
Questions? Is this the nearest mic? Yes, it is.
Hi, I'm Marie Derringer. It seems that your talk was from a U.S. company's perspective, and I was just wondering what, if anything, would be different given that some of the BRICS, notably China and India, are already going into those second-tier markets.
Yeah.
And is that a positive? Are there synergies to follow them and be there, or to dogpile on the same next-tier countries? Or would it be better to avoid the competition?
Right. That's a very good question, and you're absolutely right. My talk was a little bit from a U.S. perspective, and the reason is because the companies that you mentioned, the Brits, the European companies, the Swiss companies, they're already ahead of the game. In most of those companies, if I look in my industry and the competition, our competitors are, I would say, a decade ahead of the game in terms of globalizing and in terms of looking at the next tier of markets. I'll give you an example. GlaxoSmithKline, a big competitor of both Mercks and Novartis's. I mean, GlaxoSmithKline now they don't have an Africa strategy. They have a Kenya strategy. They have a Nigeria strategy. They have a Botswana strategy. I mean, that is literally the level of specificity and the level of detail and the level of experience they have. Sanofi Aventis is another significant, French, German, from the get-go, very globally oriented. They are buying and creating infrastructures and footprints in places like Laos, which doesn't appear on anybody's list. And so that's the level of, I would say, advancement that they have. So that would be my first. So I was really speaking from a U.S. multinational perspective because that's in part kind of my reality and what I've been working with in the last few years. Now, you asked a very good question, which is it best to go after them, or is it best to find someplace else? I guess part of it depends on how deep your pockets are. Right now, if you were just setting out and you were trying to enter China, that would be a really, really tough slog. I mean, you would need a lot of money, a lot of patience, and a lot of nerves to really withstand. I think a lot of nerves withstand what your P&L is going to look like for the next 5 to 10 years. So, I would tend to say that if your strategic goal is to win globally and to really have your fair share of the global market, then you have no alternative. You must go to China and you must go to India, and you need to figure out a way to win. If your goals are a little bit more modest, then I would probably be of the mind to avoid the direct competition in those markets, and instead to compete in those markets that are less competitive. Compete in Indonesia, compete in Vietnam, compete in Thailand, compete in Peru, compete in Chile. And the interesting thing is we have actually seen examples of companies that do this, perhaps not intentionally, but even unintentionally, and then are able to use those successes as springboards for success in the larger nearby markets. So win in Pakistan, win in Bangladesh, and create the capabilities, the understanding, the consumer learnings that you need to win in the surrounding markets. Same thing could be said for Asia or even for Latin America. So that would be my own prescription if someone asked me which is better, to follow or to play elsewhere.
Dionysios, one of the things you mentioned last night, which I think was interesting, you didn't bring it up in your remarks, is that every country you've entered in over the years, you found a way to make money from day one. And that's kind of interesting, except China.
Except China.
Okay. Well, tell us why, and tell us why not China.
Right. That's a good, interesting question. As Ravi said, I don't know exactly, but during the span of my career, I probably started businesses from scratch in about 25 to 30 emerging markets. And we're talking about really emerging markets, right? We're talking Mongolia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Latvia, et cetera, and Algeria, Tunisia. I mean, really fairly far-flung, Afghanistan, fairly far-flung markets. And the truth is that they have been profitable from year one, except for China. Now, why they've been profitable, I think one of the things that I actually experienced, and I've actually experienced it in my current company, is that there is a model of entering markets that presupposes infrastructure. I remember speaking to a colleague on the leadership team a couple of years ago, saying, "Well, I really feel that we need to begin our operations in Indonesia, given the importance of Indonesia and the fact that we're already quite strong in several of the other Southeast Asian markets." And she said, "Well, okay, have you gotten tax, legal, compliance, product supply, involved?" And I said, "No, I just want to hire one person," right? It's all about basically, there is a model that is very infrastructure heavy, that involves a lot of consultants, that involves an enormous amount of planning, which is then, I believe, unlikely to yield a positive P&L in year one. There's a softer model, is partnering with local distributors and local agents who understand how to work with global multinationals. It's about selecting the right one or two people who are entrepreneurial, who understand, again, the values that we bring, and then giving them and empowering them, giving them the resources and empowering them to drive the business. And in every single case that I've done that, we have had positive results, positive P&L, no compliance issues to speak of, and very, very vibrant successes. Now, why not China? Why not China is because I think, first of all, we were late to China. If you look at companies, Johnson & Johnson entered China 30 years ago with a partnership with a local Chinese company. GlaxoSmithKline entered China 20 years ago. When I was at Novartis, we entered China 6 years ago. So by that time, the competitive landscape is just prohibitive. Talent costs are huge. And let's also not forget that the complexity of China in terms of its distribution structure really requires assets on the ground, people that are going to simply create a different P&L. So most companies struggle to get a positive P&L in China even after 5 years of operations. And many of you I see nodding heads here, that many of you probably experience the same thing. There are companies that have not made a profit in 20 years in China. And nonetheless, it is still an incredibly important value-creating opportunity in China because of its phenomenal growth rate.
Okay, I think our time is up.
Okay.
Time for one more? Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Mike Crawford, Epoxy Technology. We sell adhesives on a worldwide basis. One of the surprising things I saw on your list from 2050 was Nigeria. And I'm wondering what makes them different from their surrounding countries, and is it just their natural resources, or is there something else in manufacturing that will make them leap the list?
I think you hit one of them, is natural resources. Obviously, the oil wealth in Indonesia is tremendous. The other thing they have going for them is 100 million people. It's one of the most populous countries in Africa. So I think the combination of those two factors weigh very heavily. Now, there are obviously other factors as well in terms of their evolving infrastructures, as well as the slow but evolving corporate governance infrastructure. Again, not moving anywhere nearly as fast as most companies would like it, but I think a combination of the consumer pool in Nigeria plus the natural resources is what propels it to that grouping. Okay, thank you very much.